So in our first video we looked at how clutches work. Now we're going to take a look at clutch failures. What causes them, and in some cases how to prevent them from happening. So again, when we have a problem with the clutch, we want to identify what's caused this problem so it doesn't happen again. So damaged clutch pressure plates are one of the things that can happen, and this could be for something that's misadjusted, something that's come apart. And we want to identify that so we can repair it so that it doesn't happen again. So when we're taking a look at clutch release levers, so these are inside the clutch housing. This is on a pull style clutch. So a fork that gets excessively worn, a fork that's broken, and it could be from a flaw, it could be from misuse, it could be from misalignment, it could be from worn parts. And we want to know what's doing this so that not just replacing the one part and hope it doesn't happen again, is taking a good look at the clutch itself. So for instance, if we have hot spots on an intermediate plate, so when we replace a clutch, it comes with a new intermediate plate and new friction discs. Never reuse an old intermediate plate because of the wear patterns that are on it. Hot spots are hardened points on intermediate plates and flywheels and pressure plates. So when we're replacing a clutch itself, we're replacing the pressure plate, the intermediate plate, and both friction discs. And again, we have to reface the flywheel in order to get rid of these hot spots. And what they'll do is they will cut those hot spots out back down to soft metal. Otherwise, what's going to happen is our friction discs are just going to slide over there and they aren't going to grip properly. Other things, again, anytime we're taking a clutch apart, we should be inspecting it to see what's wrong with it. Here, again, we have a crack through the intermediate plate. So what's caused this? Well, it could be a flaw, it could be overloading the clutch. You'll see a lot of the clutches will have check marks on them, and that's quite normal. But when the check marks get to the edge of any of the plates, that's when the crack will occur. So in this one here, there's no indication what caused it to start. But if we look, it might be a flaw in here where we get some check marks. And again, if the check marks get to the edge, that's when a crack can go through the intermediate plate. When we were talking about recessed clutches in the previous video, anytime that we put these drive lugs on, there's a special tool to make sure that the drive lugs stay square. If the drive lug is loose, it's going to start to wear out our intermediate plate, and it could cause that clutch to hang up and not engage or not release properly. When we're looking at also at clutches, anytime we have a problem, if we drop the clutch and this breaks off, that clutch's pressure plate's useless. We can't use it anymore because it becomes unbalanced. You can't weld it because these holes drilled here are for balancing, and it would be an unbalanced clutch. So be careful when you're moving around because they are heavy. On our clutch release bearing, there is a plate here that goes over, and it is part of using for our clutch brake. So for applying our clutch brake, this steel plate has to be here. As this bearing, as you can see, it's starting to come apart, and that's usually from lack of lubrication. So on the very bottom here, there's a grease fitting. Now anytime we're doing a service on the clutch, we should be greasing this release bearing. This one here, excessively damaged. When we're taking a look at our release lever, now this is on a push style clutch. What happens here is if our linkage isn't set properly, our release bearing runs all the time, and as it wears out, it's going to start to wear into our levers. Taking a look at our torsion springs. Again, what do our torsion springs do? Well, the torsion springs, as we release our clutch, will take up the load so we get a smooth engagement. As the clutch gets old, these torsion springs again will wear, and what we want to look for is, if let's just say we are not replacing the clutch, we are taking out to replace the main seal, the rear engine seal. We want to take a look at all these components and make sure that nothing's coming apart here, so that we put it back in and have to remove the transmission again and replace the clutch. So always inspect all the components, see how much wear we have in them. When we take a look again at this one here, we can see some cracks that are starting to form around here, and eventually what will happen is it will break off, and then we won't have any drive at all on this hub. Another thing we want to take a look at is the ceramic facing. So again, as it starts to come apart, the amount of material there to hold that clutch in engagement is going to be less and less, and we're going to start to slip our clutch. We talked about organic clutches. Again, they take a lot of abuse, but as the lining starts to wear, it's going to come apart. Center hub cracks again. Again, as these torsion springs take up the load, this hub's going to crack and come apart. On a solidly mounted hub, again, there's no torsion springs to take up the load, so all of that load's placed on this steel ring. When we're taking a look at our release fork, again, if it hits the back of the clutch, it will start to make some noise, and that's from worn components internally. Our clutch adjusters, so there are a couple different styles. We looked at one in particular when we looked at the first video. This is another one where we'll take a wrench, push it in, and use this adjuster to adjust it. Now, what happens if our ring is starting to seize? If we put too much force on this adjuster, we're going to bend it. So we'd have to replace that. And chances are, if the adjusting ring is seized, the clutch has to come out. Taking a look at the worn clutch brake. So again, over a period of time, when the clutch brake starts to get worn out, the material on the clutch brake itself is going to come apart, and in a case like this, it's time to replace the clutch brake. Now, when we're looking at a single clutch brake itself, again, this is replaced any time that we're replacing the clutch. We've got to put a new clutch brake on. But anytime we're inspecting and greasing, doing a service on the clutch, we want to check the facing on these clutch brakes. It's a quick, easy check. It's just a visual check with a flashlight. So while we're in there greasing it, just take a flashlight and look up inside. Now, pilot bearings are another thing. Is we can't just take a look at the pilot bearing because it's in behind the pressure plate and the flywheel, and we just can't see in there. So it's get in the habit of, any time we're pulling the clutch out, replace the pilot bearing. The other thing we want to look at is the input shaft. So there's a brass bushing inside the pressure plate that slides back and forth on this when we are disengaging the clutch. So checking for wear on our input shaft, because if we have to replace this, it's easier to replace it when we got the clutch out than it is to have to pull it back out again. What else do we want to check on our input shaft? Well, we want to check the spline. So where our drive plates go, we want to check to make sure that these are not worn, because they'll cause a clutch to hang up when we release the pedal. The other thing we want to check is the input where the pilot bearing goes. Just take a new pilot bearing and see how much play we have on there. If it fits nice, then there's not an issue, but if there's a lot of movement in there, then we have to replace our input shaft. Our release lever, again, if our bearing starts to slip, we're going to end up with an issue. So if it gets like this, we have to replace it. When we're doing our inspections, looking up inside with a flashlight, we can see anytime our bearings are starting to come apart. And again, if this is the case, the clutch has to come out and be replaced. So clutch discs hitting the flywheel or flywheel bolts. So a couple of things that we've got to pay attention to when we're installing a new clutch is, again, anytime we install a new clutch, the flywheel has to come out and be resurfaced. When we put it back together again, we want to take our disc, we want to put it up against the flywheel and turn it to make sure that none of the flywheel or the friction disc is hitting the flywheel bolts. If it is, either the flywheel is being resurfaced too many times, or our bolt heads are too large and we may have to go with smaller bolt heads. So pressure plate drive straps are bent or broken or missing. Again, what are the symptoms and what are the solutions? So pressure plate overheating, severe overheating, so hot spots. So again, what's caused that? Clutch slipping, clutch shutters, premature clutch wear. So again, look at the symptoms, the possible causes, and the solutions. Again, once we get hot spots, we usually don't turn our pressure plates, we just buy a new clutch. Worn diaphragm fingers on our pressure plate. Again, take a look at the symptoms, the probable causes, and what are the solutions. Causes of poor or notchy shifting. Causes of improper clutch release. Causes of clutch slipping. Causes of clutch chatter or shudder. Now in the last video we talked about how to adjust for wear, and again, when we put a new clutch in, what we're going to do is we're going to set, this is already preset, so we have to just adjust our external linkage to give us our proper clearances and our clutch brake. So as it starts to wear, again, when we start to lose what's called free pedal, and we'll talk about that in our next video under adjustments, is once we start to lose that free pedal, we're going to have to adjust our clutch. So what we want is approximately 1.5 to 2 inches of free pedal, and once we get down to 1/2 inch, we want to adjust that. And again, we're going to take that bolt out, take the plate out, and adjust it in a clockwise rotation. And again, we want 1 to 3 notches, and that will depend on how much free pedal we had. Clutch pressure plates, again, these release levers, there is a special tool that we use to adjust this to give us our proper clearance so it's even all the way around. Solo clutches we talked about in the first video. Again, once this lever gets over to a certain point, it's worn out. If we are taking this out for any reason other than to replace it, we have to cage it to make sure that this doesn't travel all the way over. If it does, then we have to put it in a press and reset it. Our input shaft, again, inspecting the input shaft and also this plate on the front of the transmission, because that is the plate that the clutch brake rides up against when we want to stop this input shaft. Now, one of the things that happens a lot is we install the transmission and we forget the clutch brake. So in a case like this, it's either you remove the transmission and put a 1-piece clutch brake in it, or you put a 2-piece clutch brake in. But always try and remember to install the clutch brake on this input shaft before you do anything else. Now, how we install a clutch will depend on a couple factors. So some people will install the flywheel and then install the clutch on the input shaft and then install the transmission with the clutch and bolt it up to the flywheel once the transmission's bolted to the back of the engine. Or we can install the whole clutch assembly on the flywheel and then install the transmission onto the engine. Again, don't forget to install a new pilot bearing. We looked at earlier this is where the pilot bearing rides on, so put a new pilot bearing on here and see how loose it is back and forth. If it's too loose, then we have to replace it. When we are installing a new clutch, we have clutch alignment tools to align the discs to the pilot bearing, so that when we go to install the transmission, once this is all installed and bolted in place, we just remove this and we can slide the transmission up into the housing. So clutch alignment tools come in a bunch of different sizes, and again for the splines of the transmission. So making sure that you use the right tool for the job. So making sure that it not only has the right spline configuration but also has the right size for the pilot bearing, because we want to make sure that when we go to install the transmission that it's going to slide in nice and easy and we don't have any issues. Now, we talked about resurfacing a flywheel. So anytime that we're replacing a clutch, we send the flywheel out to be resurfaced. They have all the measurements, so they will recut that and set it up properly. The other thing we talked about in the last video was on the clutch there is a recess. Now this has, on the flywheel there's a recess that this fits in properly and then is bolted into place. If this bottom part is sitting up on the recess, the bolts still will go into some of the clutches, but what we might end up with is a vibration. So if we're installing the flywheel on the engine and we're putting the whole clutch on the front of the transmission and installing it that way, we're going to start all of the bolts before we tighten them down, and then we're going to tighten them down evenly so that this will sit properly in the recess. A couple different types of clutches that we see again is we'll see recess clutch. So this is a deep dish clutch, and these ones have to be installed on the flywheel before you install the transmission, whereas this style you can do either way. When we're installing it, again, remember an engine will stop, a 6-cylinder engine will stop in any one of 3 positions. So when we're installing a new clutch, make sure that we install the adjuster in the down position so that we can always adjust it properly without having to bar the engine over. And that is it for clutch failures.